Have you ever bought something and thought, wow, this is weirdly cheap, like suspiciously cheap? And you're standing there holding the receipt thinking, okay, I'm not complaining, but how are they making money? Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Sometimes the low price is the strategy, not to serve you, to outlast everyone else. And once they're the only option left, that's when the bill shows up. Not always as a higher price, sometimes as worst quality, fewer choices, lower wages, and a whole economy that starts to feel brittle. On this episode of Bear Markets and Bad Decisions, we're talking about the OG in cheap now, trapped later, John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Act 1. Before Rockefeller. Chaos in a Barrel. Before oil powered cars, airplanes, and global politics, it powered something much smaller and much more personal: light. In the mid-1800s, kerosene lamps were how families lit their homes after sunset. One lamp in a window meant dinner could stretch longer, kids could read, sewing could continue. Life didn't stop just because the sun went down. But light came with fear, because oil back then was dangerous. The early oil industry wasn't an industry at all. It was a scramble. Thousands of small producers drilled wherever they could, refined however they wanted, and shipped with no real standards. Quality varied wildly. Barrels leaked, refineries exploded, lamps caught fire, houses burned down because someone somewhere cut a corner. Prices were just as volatile as the product. 1 month kerosene was cheap, the next month it was scarce. Families never knew what it would cost, or whether it would even be safe to use. This wasn't a story of greedy consumers or reckless buyers. It was a story of uncoordinated systems trying to grow too fast. And then enters a man who didn't look like a revolutionary. John D. Rockefeller wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He didn't chase risk for sport. He was intensely religious, deeply disciplined, and almost pathologically allergic to waste. While others gambled, Rockefeller measured. While others speculated, he standardized. While others chased oil wherever it bubbled up, he focused on one thing: refining, doing it better, cheaper, and more consistently than anyone else. Rockefeller wasn't trying to control the oil fields. He was trying to control the mess. He reinvested relentlessly. He improved processes. He squeezed inefficiencies out of barrels, shipping, storage, and refining. He cut costs not by making oil worse, but by making operations tighter. And consumers noticed. Kerosene became cheaper. It became safer. It became predictable. For the first time, families could buy oil without worrying that it would explode on their kitchen table. This is the part of the story people forget. Standard Oil solved real problems. The chaos quieted. The fires decreased. Prices stabilized. And for ordinary Americans, this felt like progress, because it was. But here's the tension that sits quietly beneath the surface of this story. The same efficiencies that made oil safer and cheaper also made it harder for anyone else to survive. At first, nobody minded, because when the lamps stay lit and the price keeps falling, it doesn't feel like something is being lost. It feels like something is finally working. And that's exactly why what came next was so easy to miss. Act 2. How Standard Oil won without raising prices. This is where the story usually gets oversimplified. Most people imagine monopolies forming because someone jacked up prices, crushed consumers, and laughed all the way to the bank. That's not what happened here. In fact, if you were an ordinary American buying kerosene in the late 1800s, it probably felt like the opposite. Prices kept falling, quality kept improving, supply became reliable. So what's the problem? The problem was where those lower prices came from and what they were quietly doing to everyone else in the market. Rockefeller didn't compete the way most businesses did. He didn't try to be slightly better or slightly cheaper everywhere. He played a longer, colder game. Instead of spreading his efforts across the entire country, Standard Oil targeted specific competitors in specific places. If a small refiner popped up in a town, Standard Oil would drop prices in that town, and only that town, sometimes below what it costs to produce the oil at all. Not forever, just long enough. The local competitor would bleed money, banks would stop lending, suppliers would get nervous. Eventually, the refiner would face a choice: sell to Standard Oil or go under. Most sold. And once they were gone, prices quietly returned to normal. From the consumer's point of view, this didn't feel sinister. It felt like competition working exactly the way it was supposed to. Prices dropped, inefficient players disappeared, the best company won. But here's the crucial detail most people miss. Standard Oil could afford to lose money in one place because it controlled so many others. It had scale, it had cash reserves, it had control over refining, storage, shipping, and distribution. Its competitors didn't. This wasn't a fair fight, not because Rockefeller cheated, but because the rules of the game favored whoever could survive the longest without profit. And survival in capitalism is often more important than brilliance. There was another advantage most competitors couldn't touch: transportation. Standard Oil negotiated secret rebates with railroads, discounts on shipping that no small refiner could get. That meant even when prices were the same on paper, Rockefeller's oil was cheaper to move, cheaper to store, and cheaper to deliver. Efficiency stacked on efficiency, and every efficiency widened the gap. To the consumer, all of this was invisible. They didn't see rail contracts. They didn't see balance sheets. They didn't see rivals quietly disappearing. They just saw oil getting cheaper and more dependable. And they assumed that meant the market was healthy. What they didn't see was that competition was being drained out of the system, one town at a time. Standard Oil didn't conquer the market in a dramatic takeover. It absorbed it slowly, methodically, almost politely. And by the time people realized how much power had consolidated into one company, the question was no longer, is this company too powerful? It was, what happens if the system breaks? Because when one company controls refining, shipping, pricing, and access, efficiency stops being resilience. It becomes fragility. And that's the moment when cheap prices stop being a blessing and start becoming dependency. Act 3. What consumers didn't notice losing. Here's the uncomfortable truth about Standard Oil. Most consumers didn't feel hurt by it, at least not at first. That's what made it so powerful. There were no sudden shortages, no dramatic price spikes, no obvious moment when people said, wait, something's wrong. Instead, something far subtler disappeared: choice. As Standard Oil absorbed competitors, Towns that once had multiple refiners suddenly had one. Suppliers who once negotiated between buyers now had a single customer. Railroads that once balanced competing contracts became dependent on Rockefeller's volume. But for ordinary families buying kerosene, none of this showed up on the receipt. The lamp still lit. The price still fell. Life went on. And that's the trap. Because markets don't fail all at once. They hollow out. Innovation slowed, not because Rockefeller banned it, but because there was no longer room for it. New refiners couldn't survive long enough to scale. Banks stopped funding startups that would immediately face price wars they couldn't win. Engineers with better ideas found themselves absorbed into one massive system instead of competing against it. And when innovation disappears, progress stops being visible. It becomes incremental, internal, and controlled. Consumers also lost leverage, though they didn't have a word for it yet. If Standard Oil changed terms, there was nowhere else to go. If suppliers disagreed with pricing, they had no alternatives. If railroads pushed back, they risked losing their biggest customer. This wasn't coercion in the dramatic sense, it was dependence. And dependence feels comfortable until it doesn't. The real danger wasn't that Standard Oil would raise prices, it was that it could, whenever it wanted, without fear of competition pushing back. That's the difference between a healthy market and a fragile one. In a healthy market, companies compete for customers. Customers can walk away. Innovation is rewarded. In a fragile market, efficiency replaces competition. Alternatives disappear. Power concentrates quietly. And by the time people begin asking whether that power is too much, the system is already structured around it. This is why Standard Oil didn't trigger outrage early on. Nothing felt broken. But systems don't need to feel broken to be dangerous. They just need to become too central to fail safely. And that's when the story shifts. Because eventually, journalists, politicians, and the public start asking a different question. Not, are prices fair, but should any one company have this much control over something everyone depends on? That question would change American capitalism forever. Act 4. When efficiency became a problem the government couldn't ignore. For a long time, Standard Oil dominance existed in a kind of gray zone. Prices were low. Supply was stable. Consumers weren't protesting in the streets. So why did anyone step in at all? Because while consumers experienced stability, everyone else in the system felt squeezed. Independent refiners vanished. Suppliers had no negotiating power. Railroads became structurally dependent on one customer. Entire regions were tied to a single corporate pipeline. And that kind of concentration does something subtle but dangerous. It makes failure catastrophic. This wasn't just about oil anymore. It was about systemic risk, long before anyone used that phrase. The first real cracks didn't come from government. They came from journalism. Investigative reporters began pulling on threads that had been invisible to the public. Contracts, rebates, quiet agreements. Patterns that on their own looked like smart business, but together formed something else entirely. The most influential of these investigations didn't rely on outrage. They relied on documentation. They showed how Standard Oil pressured competitors into selling, used selective price cuts to eliminate rivals, negotiated transportation advantages no one else could access, absorbed entire supply chains until alternatives ceased to exist. The picture that emerged wasn't of a company breaking the law in obvious ways. It was a company operating so efficiently that the law hadn't kept up. That distinction matters, because this wasn't about fraud, it was about structure. Eventually, public pressure reached a tipping point. Politicians, many of whom had initially admired Rockefeller's success, began to worry less about prices and more about power. What happens when one company controls refining, storage, transportation, pricing, access to markets? What happens if it makes a mistake, or changes priorities, or collapses under its own weight? The answer was uncomfortable. The entire economy would feel it. That's when the government finally stepped in, not to punish success, but to reintroduce competition. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil broken up into smaller companies. And here's the part that surprises people. Rockefeller didn't lose his fortune. He became richer. Because the breakup didn't destroy value, it redistributed it. Shares in the new company soared. Ownership fragmented, but wealth remained intact. This wasn't vengeance, it was recalibration. The goal wasn't to erase Standard Oil from history. It was to prevent any one company from becoming so central that the system depended on it functioning perfectly forever. That's the key lesson. Antitrust wasn't born out of envy. It was born out of fear. Fear of what happens when efficiency outruns resilience. And that fear would go on to shape American economic policy for generations. Act 5. The quiet detour that changed everything. Normally, this is the point in the episode where I'd bring us back to present day. But before we do that, we need to take a short detour. Back to the 1970s and 1980s. Because this is where the story quietly changes direction. Up until this point, the lesson of Standard Oil was pretty clear. America had learned, the hard way, that markets don't always fix themselves, that competition doesn't magically reappear once it's been crushed, and that when power concentrates too much, even low prices can hide serious danger. That's why antitrust laws exist in the first place. They weren't designed to punish success. They were designed to preserve competition, to keep the door open for the next innovator, the next challenger, the next idea. But then something subtle happened. Beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s, the way America thought about antitrust quietly changed. The question regulators used to ask was simple: is this company becoming too powerful? The new question became, are prices going up? If prices stayed low or fell, concentration was largely ignored. This shift didn't happen because lawmakers suddenly loved monopolies. It happened because efficiency became the hero of the story. Cheaper was good, bigger looked better, and scale started to feel like progress. This new framework had a name: the Consumer Welfare Standard, and it narrowed the entire purpose of antitrust down to one metric: price. not resilience, not choice, not long-term competition, just price. And this is where the Rockefeller thought experiment matters. If John D. Rockefeller were operating under this new interpretation, much of what made Standard Oil illegal would have been low prices, check, improved quality, check, consumer savings, absolutely. Under the new rules, Rockefeller wouldn't look like a threat. He'd look like a success story. The very behaviors that once triggered alarm bells, vertical integration, aggressive pricing, absorbing competitors, were now often seen as evidence that the market was working. What this shift effectively did was nullify the original lesson of Standard Oil. It told regulators to stop worrying about power unless it showed up as pain at the checkout line. But as history had already shown us, and would show us again, power doesn't always hurt immediately. Sometimes it just rearranges the future. This wasn't a dramatic deregulation moment. There was no single law ripped out overnight. It was quieter than that. Enforcement softened. Cases became rarer. Mergers sailed through with little resistance. And slowly, the guardrails that once kept efficiency from turning into dominance began to fade. Nothing exploded, nothing collapsed, but the system became vulnerable again, in exactly the way it had been before. Which brings us back to the present. Because once antitrust stopped asking who controls the system and focused only on how cheap things feel today, it opened the door for a very familiar pattern to return. Only this time, prices didn't just fall, they went to zero. Act 6. When prices hit zero and power didn't. So now we can finally come back to the present. Because once antitrust stopped asking who controls the system and focused only on whether prices were rising, it opened the door for something entirely new. Markets where prices didn't just fall, they disappeared. Search engines that were free, social networks that cost nothing, email, maps, videos, shopping, all $0 at the point of use. And for consumers, this felt like winning the lottery. Why pay for software when you can just use it for free? Why shop anywhere else when everything is one click away? Why complain when convenience keeps improving and prices never go up? Just like with Standard Oil, the early experience was genuinely positive. Services improved rapidly, innovation exploded, access expanded. This didn't feel like consolidation, it felt like progress. But here's the shift that matters. These companies weren't competing on price, they were competing on scale. And scale behaves differently. The goal wasn't to be slightly better than competitors. The goal was to become the platform competitors had to use. And once that happens, the old rules stop applying. Think about how the American dream quietly changed. It used to be, build something great, grow it, compete, win. Now, more often it's, build something great and sell it to a platform before it crushes you. Not because founders lack ambition, but because competing with companies that control distribution, discovery, infrastructure, and user data is nearly impossible. This is where the Standard Oil parallel snaps into focus. Rockefeller controlled refining, shipping, storage, access to markets. Modern platforms control search, marketplace, advertising, attention, behavior. Different century, same structure. We'll never know how many ideas died quietly, products designed by some unknown engineer that could have changed our lives but never made it past a boardroom because one of the FANG companies bought them, shelved them, and moved on. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable, but matters the most. When a service is free, you are not the customer. You are the input. Your data, your attention, your habits, your behavior. These are the products. That doesn't mean these companies are evil. It means they are rational actors operating inside a system that stopped treating concentration as dangerous, as long as prices stayed low. Standard Oil used below-cost pricing to eliminate competitors. Big Tech uses zero-cost pricing to do the same thing. And just like before, consumers don't feel harmed right away. Because the harm doesn't show up as a charge. It shows up as fewer alternatives, locked-in ecosystems, reduced innovation at the edges, dependence on systems you can't realistically leave. This is why people feel uneasy even while using products they love. They sense, correctly, that the system no longer feels open, that the ladder they climbed is being quietly pulled up behind them. And here's the hardest truth of all. Nothing here is technically broken. Prices are low, services work, convenience is unmatched. But the system is fragile, just like it was with Standard Oil. Because when power concentrates at the platform level, failure stops being local, it becomes systemic. A single policy change can reshape entire industries. A single algorithm tweak can decide who lives or dies economically. A single company's priorities can ripple through millions of livelihoods. That's not a market correcting itself. That's a market organized around dependency. And once again, we find ourselves relearning the same lesson America learned over a century ago. Efficiency without competition doesn't create freedom. It creates comfort until it doesn't. Standard Oil taught us that cheap prices can hide dangerous levels of power. The tech era taught us something even sharper. When prices hit zero, power becomes almost invisible. And invisible power is the hardest kind to challenge. Because by the time people feel it, the system is already built around it. So that was a lot. If you're feeling slightly unsettled right now, congratulations, you were paying attention. But before we all spiral into existential crisis about monopolies and data surveillance, let's zoom back out for a second. This story wasn't meant to make you cynical. It was meant to make you curious. Because history isn't a warning label, it's a user manual. And once you've seen the pattern, you start spotting it everywhere. The pricing tricks, the quiet consolidation, the "don't worry, this is good for you" energy. You can't unsee it, but you can understand it. And honestly, understanding the system is the first step toward not being quietly steamrolled by it. Because the system will only change when people make their representatives change it. If you enjoyed this episode, or if it made you want to throw your phone across the room, do me a favor. Follow or subscribe to the show, leave a review, or send this episode to someone who still thinks monopolies only exist in a board game. It genuinely helps more than you think. This has been Bear Markets and Bad Decisions. I'm Heather Shell, and I'm keeping my prices just as they are.